Joined by Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Robert Costa, national political reporter for The Washington Post, and Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. What Woodward says in his book about this president are basically he is incapable of expressing the truth because he doesn't know how to actually word it. And more scary to me that he's unattached to reality. Now he's coming out and saying he deserves A-pluses for his handling of hurricanes, and basically is ignoring what looks to be the storm warnings of him losing both houses of Congress in November.
Well, President Trump is someone who wants to look like he's winning at all times, even if he's lost. Obviously, more than 3,000 people, or some 3,000 people, were killed in Hurricane Maria. People had no electricity in Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, for more than a year. So there's this idea that he doesn't want to deal with any of that. He doesn't want to deal with the reality that there were people suffering because of the things that his government failed to do. So in his response, instead of kind of taking credit for that, he's saying, well, really, it's this mayor of San Juan who's been very critical and open about how much I should have done differently, and as a result, he's attacking.
So he's picked a fight with a minority woman.
Yes.
That's not unusual, is it?
No, it's not.
Okay, let me go to Robert Costa. You know, is he thinking about the optics, or is he thinking about the performance? I get the sense that Bill Shine, the optics guy, is going to be in charge of this hurricane coming to the Carolinas.
Sometimes the optics are out of your control. A hurricane is not a TV studio. You look back at 2012, talking to Republicans all day. They say President Obama handled Sandy, went to New Jersey, worked with a Republican and Governor Chris Christie. But this could also be, this coming hurricane, hopefully for not the people on the ground, but it could be like Katrina was for the Bush administration. It's a test for an administration. And you're right, they're facing two waves, that blue wave too for the Democrats.
Yeah, well, Tim O'Brien, you're an expert on Trump. Go back to this. Is he capable of seeing what's coming as reality, or is he just, you know, I hear that he doesn't like to prepare. He likes to improvise. But part of improvising, it seems he's got to recognize truth. Does he realize he could lose both houses of Congress this November? Does he recognize that this is a Category 4 hurricane, which requires real executive skill in dealing with it?
Whether or not he recognizes it, Chris, I don't know how much he authentically cares about it. I think one of the president's strengths historically is that he is a survivor. He cares a lot about self-aggrandizement and a lot about survival. And one of the keys to him being a survivor is that he lives in his own reality distortion field. He's almost impervious sometimes to advice, and he's certainly impervious to the fact pattern. When it comes to November, I think he's going to be looking away from that, and he will blame it on the GOP. He'll blame it on Paul Ryan. He'll blame it on the party. He'll blame it on Mitch McConnell. He won't take any responsibility for whatever results in November. When it comes, to hurricane relief, this is something that should reside right in his wheelhouse. He is a builder and a developer. He sees himself as a can-do person. What happened in Puerto Rico a year ago, despite how he's tried to spin this, is the hurricane made landfall in Puerto Rico on September 20th. He didn't convene a national security meeting on the situation in a Situation Room meeting on the situation in Puerto Rico until 6 days later. And yes, they were confronted with an island that was distant from the states. They had to fly supplies in.
They can't vote.
But those Puerto Ricans can vote, and a lot of them have gone to Florida. So he's going to have an electoral reality around that. But the other thing is the Obama administration got relief to Haiti in 2010, even though it was an island in the middle of a big ocean. I think the test on Florence is, can he orchestrate a mature, sophisticated response to a natural disaster? And I think that's a wait and see.
Well, as I mentioned before, author Rob Woodward issued a stark warning this week that the Trump White House isn't prepared for a crisis. Here's Bob.
You look at the operation of this White House, and you have to say, let's hope to God we don't have a crisis. People who work for him are worried that he will sign things or give orders that threaten the national security or the financial security of the country or the world.
Well, according to Woodward's book, the president does not like to prepare himself for the responsibilities of the office he holds. As one aide concluded, Trump acted like doing too much advanced preparation would diminish his skills in improvising, as if a plan would take away his power. What do you make of that?
Well, I'll say this. the president won on his gut. He believes in his gut. He believes on this idea that he can captain his own ship, and as a result, he knows what's best. The problem is that empathy is a big part of the presidential job, and it's something that President Trump hasn't done well. Every time the nation's looked at him, think of Charlottesville to try to bring us together. He's really failed at that. So as a result, now you're having this big hurricane that's coming, and instead of saying, oh my God, we need to make sure we've learned from our mistakes, we want to try to make sure that the people feel safe. He's saying some of that on Twitter, but he can't help but also say, this is really about me, and I did such a great job, and I'm getting accolades. He literally said in the White House today that he should get accolades, and he's getting accolades from Congress from all the things that he's doing.
Well, let me go to Robert. Do you have a sense that this is true? Do you buy the fact, the Woodward article, do you buy the fact that Trump doesn't like to prepare? In other words, if he knows there's a hurricane coming to the Carolinas, you get a bunch of people in the room with charts and everything else. You say, okay, what's our plan? When it hits, what are you going to play? Who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be FEMA's going to do this? Are the governor going to do this? What's the governor? How's that relationship? Where's the war room? Who's going to do it? And when am I going to get the call when I have to release federal money? Doesn't he not do that? He would do that, wouldn't he? Wouldn't he do that minimal planning for a hurricane?
Woodward's depiction of the president's trait is accurate. Look back to the campaign. The president had a whole plan for the transition. He ripped it up. He didn't want to even address
That's
the
right.
transition.
He said, I don't want to, it'll
superstitious.
Yeah, it'll spook me.
And he wanted to run on his instincts. But the government is separate from the president. The buck stops with the president. Every president, you have to answer for how your government handles these kind of situations. But the government, when you talk to people inside of the administration, they say, we're moving on with this hurricane in preparation, regardless of what the president wants. They do say he could face a political challenge. And why didn't he do infrastructure first? Why did he go after the tax cut and health care? Did he really prepare this country infrastructure-wise for a hurricane? But
optics is going to be really important here. When I talk to sources at the White House, they say that the president really cares about the country. People need to understand that. Well, remember the optics from Hurricane Maria. It was the president throwing paper towels at people in the middle of a disaster. So maybe he's learned from that and at least will say, okay, I'm going to take their advice and not go and throw paper towels at people.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.